back to Reading with Miss Michelle. Today we're going to read Wayside School is Falling Down by Louis Sachar, Chapter 28. If you have a copy, go get it so you can read along with me. Don't forget to help us out by liking, subscribing, and sharing this video with all of your friends. Chapter 28. Valouche. Mrs. Jules rang her cowbell. "I have some wonderful news," she said. The children stopped what they were doing and looked up. They waited for Mrs. Jules to tell them the wonderful news. "You are a very lucky class indeed," said Mrs. Jules. "Mrs. Walouche, the world-famous dancer, will be coming here to Wayside School. She will teach you how to dance." Everyone was still waiting for the wonderful news. "Isn't that exciting?" asked Mrs. Jules. "You will see her every Wednesday instead of going to P.E. "Will girls have to dance with boys?" asked Jenny. "I suppose," said Mrs. Jules. "Gross!" exclaimed Leslie. "Yuck!" said Dana. "Will boys have to dance with girls?" asked Ron. "Obviously," said Mrs. Jules. "No way," said Eric Fry. "I'd rather dance with a dead rat," said Terrence. Everybody started talking at once about cooties and warts and other horrible diseases you get from touching girls or boys. Mrs. Jules rang her cowbell again and told them to settle down. "Mrs. Jules, I don't want to take dancing lessons," said Eric Bacon. "I already know how to dance." "Yes, Eric, I've seen you dance," Mrs. Jules said sarcastically. Eric Bacon was a great break dancer, but breakdancing was no longer allowed at Wayside School. That was because every time Eric danced, he broke something. "Mrs. Walouche will teach you the grace and beauty of classical ballroom dancing," said Mrs. Jules. Everybody groaned. On Wednesday, they all headed down to their first dancing lesson. Except Myron. Myron went to P.E. "How come Myron never has to do anything?" asked Jason. "I don't know," said Calvin. "I've been wondering about that too." "Myron's father must be friends with the president," said Bibi. "I think Myron gave Mr. Kidswatter $1,000, said Todd. "No, I bet he's blackmailing Mrs. Jules," said Jenny. "How could he do that?" asked Benjamin. "Maybe Mrs. Jules got drunk," said Jenny, "and then she danced on top of her desk with a lampshade on her head. And Myron took her picture. And so now Mrs. Jules has to let Myron do anything he wants, or else he'll show the picture to Mr. Kidswatter." "That makes sense," said Mac. "Except if she had a lampshade on her head, how would Mr. Kidswatter know it was Mrs. Jules?" asked Todd. No one knew the answer to that. They entered the room on the second floor. "Welcome," said Mrs. Walouche, a strange-looking woman with bright red hair. It looked like her head was on fire. "My name is Ms. Walouche. It's so wonderful to be here at Wayside School." She wore pink tights and a sparkling pink top. "I hope we will be friends, yes?" she asked. Nobody said a word. All around were red and green balls. There was also one yellow ball. This was the room where Louis kept the balls for lunch and recess. It was also the room that was always used for school dances. It was the ballroom. "So," exclaimed Madame Walouche, "who will be first?" Everyone tried to hide behind someone else. Mrs. Walouche put her hands on Ron's face. "What is your name?" she asked. "Ron," he squeaked. "Ronaldo," bellowed Mrs. Walouche. "King of the gypsies." "I don't know how to dance," said Ron. "Dance?" said Mrs. Walouche. She looked very surprised. "We are not going to dance," she said. "We're not?" asked Ron. "No, Ronaldo," whispered Mrs. Walouche. "We are going to tango." She put her left arm around Ron's waist. Then she grabbed his left hand with her right and stuck it way out in front of them. Suddenly, the music started. Mrs. Walouche dragged poor Ron across the room as she stomped her feet in time to the music. Thump, Dump, 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 da da dump, 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 da dump, dump. Hey! When she yelled hey, she threw Ron up in the air and clapped her hands. Ron turned a somersault in midair. Then Mrs. Walush caught him. They tangoed back to where they started. Ron's eyes were spinning in opposite directions. Hey, that looked like fun, said Mauricia. Do me. Very well, said Mrs. Walush. She grabbed Mauricia and tangoed with her across the room. Dump, 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 da-da-dump, dump, 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 dump. Hey! She threw Mauricia up in the air and clapped her hands. Mauricia turned a double somersault before Mrs. Walush caught her. They tangoed back to the front. My turn, said Terence. As Mrs. Walush tangoed with Terence, the other kids stamped their feet along with Mrs. Walush. They all yelled, hey, at the same time and clapped their hands. One by one, Mrs. Walush tangoed with every kid in the class. The other kids danced with each other. Boys danced with girls, and girls danced with boys. They didn't care. Paul danced with Leslie, Dana danced with John, Terence danced with Rondi, Allison danced with Jason, DJ danced with Kathy, Todd danced with Joy. Hey! They all shouted together. Of course, they weren't strong enough to throw each other up in the air. Instead, they tried to trip each other and throw each other to the ground. Hey! Even Kathy was having fun. Hey! She shouted as she kicked DJ in the rear end. They also threw the balls at each other. Hey! Mrs. Walush began to get tired. Sometimes she didn't catch the children after she tossed them in the air. Dee Dee crashed to the floor. Wow, she said. This is more fun than Murder the Man with the Ball. Hey! At last the music stopped. Dump, 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 dump. And everyone shouted, hey, one last time. Mrs. Walush clapped her hands. Wonderful, she exclaimed. Fantastique. They all staggered out of the ballroom, cut up, bruised, and bleeding. Next week, we waltz, Mrs. Walush called after them. So how did everyone like dancing? Asked Mrs. Jules when they returned. Dance, asked Ronald, king of the gypsies. We didn't dance. You didn't? Asked Mrs. Jules. No, said Ronald. We tangoed. Everyone cheered. It was wonderful, exclaimed Kathy. Fantastic, said Terence. Myron was sorry he missed it. I can't wait till next Wednesday, said Todd. The end. Thanks for joining me for Chapter 28. Please check back for Chapter 29. Don't forget to help us out by liking, subscribing, and sharing this video with all of your friends. I hope you join me next time. Bye.